Well, thank you once again, Sabrina Nanji, for coming on. We were talking last time we had you on. We were talking about would we, won't we, in the springtime be having an Ontario election? Well, you called it, except it was a little bit earlier than we thought it was going to be. So we are starting into the Ontario provincial election a year earlier than was supposed to be scheduled. Sabrina, thank you for coming on to give us a lay of the land as we start down this chapter of Ontario.
Yeah, I think you're right. It was a little bit anticlimactic when we officially got the writs on Wednesday, January 29th, because this was something that we had heard was coming for a long time. And yeah, Doug Ford finally pulled the trigger, and we are now in full-on campaign mode officially at Queen's Park. I think, day one of the campaign was like an absolute blur. We had all four of the main party leaders launching their campaigns at the exact same moment, competing for airtime, and all of them trying to like define what they think the race is going to be about. I mean, just really quickly, Doug Ford obviously thinks this is about Trump's tariff threat, and he's launched this Protect Ontario campaign. He says he's the best guy to be across from Trump, but meanwhile, at that same press conference, reporters were poking holes in that theory. Asking him, "Have you actually had a meeting with Trump? Have you ever?" The answer is no. And there's a lot of questions about what Doug Ford can actually do, because the feds are sort of taking the lead here, of course. Meanwhile, Marit Stiles and the NDP, they actually went through Ford's missteps, but then they struck a more positive tone. Time to turn the page. Marit Stiles is on your side. We heard a lot of that. They were over in Toronto Center. Doug Ford was in Windsor, of course, on the border with Detroit. Marit Stiles was in Toronto Center, a seat that they're going to want to hang on to if they want to keep official opposition or even move to government. Meanwhile, Bonnie Crombie chose to launch her campaign in Barrie with her Liberal co-campaign chair, Rose Zacharias, who's running in Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte, the closest race in 2022, and, within 300 points for the Liberals, who actually had a very popular candidate in former Mayor Jeff Lehman there. Obviously, Rose Zacharias, former head of the Ontario Medical Association. It's clear that Bonnie Crombie thinks that, healthcare is going to be the big issue. We heard her saying this election's unnecessary. She might pivot to start talking about Ford's record on healthcare. And then finally, Green leader Mike Schreiner, he's talking about people over profits. And that's been Doug Ford's whole shtick. And obviously, the Greens, they only have two seats in the House. They're in fourth place, but they tend to target their resources in key ridings they think they can win. So they want to hold on to Guelph and Kitchener Center. Meanwhile, they're pushing really hard for Parry Sound, Muskoka, and places like Bruce Grey, Owen Sound, and Wellington, Halton Hills. So that's my
Mhm.
spiel. It already feels like a hurricane.
Well, I do want to kind of touch on that point because the last time you were on the podcast, we there was this will they, won't they? Maybe in the springtime we'll be talking about a provincial election, and the idea was this was going to happen in March, and the election would be held in about April. Um, Federally, a very different scene. The Liberals were tanking in the polls. It looked like we were going to have a super majority for Pierre Poilievre. Uh, Doug Ford was riding high in the polls as well, and it kind of made sense for him to pull the trigger then. Right now, I get the sense like the game, the playing board has completely changed. As you said, Donald Trump's now the sitting president sworn in, and we're now every day there's a new threat of tariffs or there's some action, or it's going to be a wild 4 years with Trump at the helm. Um, but with Justin Trudeau out of the equation, those polling numbers at the federal level have started to change. There is a lot more liquid now, and I feel like that's impacting the provincial scene because I get the sense that Trump, or sorry, Ford is more gearing towards that old axiom of Ontario always wants the opposite party in power in Ottawa as it has at Queen's Park, and that seems to me what was fueling the decision always from the get go. And I'm wondering, maybe your conversations with some PC insiders, PC folks on the ground, are any of them second guessing this call now? Because the polls are showing in Ontario that there's it's not an appetite for an election right now, um, and I'm wondering like it's a little bit of regret or just a second guess of like, oh my god, maybe we did blow this one.
I mean, I think that you're right that there's a lot that's changed, right? But generally, I feel like the conservatives are feeling very confident right now and that they're ready to go. But I do know that from I guess more of the campaign managers on the ground, the people that are like, boots on the ground in February, they're the ones saying that they feel rushed. But I think yeah, like so much has changed, right, since we were last talking about this. Trump is now president officially, but also what I've been hearing from like the PC insiders is that what really like put this into high gear, like we got to go now. What like even like the premier or then premier, I keep referring to him as premier, but of course we refer to
Mhm.
him as PC leader now that we're in the campaign. But that even in the beginning of this year, Ford actually hadn't made up his mind that he wanted to pull the trigger yet. And it was only when things shifted in Ottawa. We got Trudeau's announcement of his resignation, the timeline for the Liberal leadership race. And you're right, they are paying attention to this Underhill theory and dynamic that we have in Ontario, that we always elect opposites at Queen's Park and on Parliament Hill. And so with all the polls suggesting Pierre Poilievre could take this, and especially, polling well in Ontario, Doug Ford obviously doesn't want to be dealing with the consequences for him at Queen's Park.
Mhm.
And there is buzz that Poilievre could bring down cuts, and none of the provincial premiers want to wear that in their own respective provinces. So a lot has changed, I think. But you're like, I think that's also where Ford's rationale for this could potentially fall apart, and voters punish him if they see this as opportunistic and self-serving. Like, it's the most advantageous for Doug Ford to pull the trigger now. And there's a lot of uncertainty with Trump. Like, we don't really have the details of what these tariffs are going to look like. And this is something that Ford hasn't refused to rule out since last spring. Like, even if he hadn't made up his mind, I mean, that it's funny how it came full circle, with the announcement last spring of them speeding up the liberalization of alcohol sales, and that started people questioning, is this an early election ploy here? And we sort of came full circle that just days before the actual launch of the campaign, the budget watchdog put out this report saying that it's going to be 3 times as much as Ford had said it was going to cost us to liberalize alcohol sales. So a bit of a damper for them on that. But yeah, I mean, there is questions here. I don't know though if voters are if that's how much that's going to stick with voters. Like, it's going to be up to Bonnie Crombie and Marit Stiles to really hammer that point home, that this is self-serving, it's opportunistic. Doug Ford is only in it for himself. But after the first couple of like days and weeks, I'm not sure if after the debate, if that will still be an issue for people, and then we'll start to dig into like the more policy issues type of campaigning, like healthcare and housing.
Right. Some of the punditry that I'm reading as we're now in the early stages of this election is this echoes of David Peterson, who younger listeners, if you don't know, called an early election in the middle of his majority government. Uh, it's only 3 years into his term, and he was just hammered by the Ontario people for triggering an early election. Um, I know that the provincial Tories were very much studying that situation because they didn't want an echo of that, and I'm wondering how are the NDP or the Liberals kind of poised to kind of take advantage of that narrative, perhaps, and start drilling the home of we don't, nobody wants this election. It's there's uncertainty. We're the only province in Confederation that's having an election right now, and every other province is facing the same threat of the tariffs as Ontario. You know, I guess my question, it's a long-winded way of saying, like, how prepared are the Liberals and the NDP for this election? Because they were a distant. There's like a race for third place with them, it seemed. And I'm wondering, are they ready for this to kind of take advantage of this kind of shift in the public mood?
Yeah, I mean, it has been interesting because, like I said, it felt anticlimactic. We all suspected and had, a very strong hunch that we were going to get an early election call. And, I had been speaking with both, campaign war room people and the NDP and the Liberals, and they had, been planning for 3 timelines, potentially going to the polls last fall, this winter and this spring. And yet they're still scrambling, well, already into the campaign to nominate candidates, especially especially in key ridings for both of those parties. That the New Democrats, it's a little trickier for them. Just their party constitution and the way that's run, it's hard for them to just appoint candidates. So that they might be a little bit slower. But the Liberals, I mean, they don't have Toronto Center, for instance, filled yet as of this recording, and so it has been still a struggle for them. The NDP had been sort of strategic in waiting to launch their TV ads, which of course are expensive. Even though the NDP says that they've got 10 million in the bank, it's nowhere near what the Conservatives have been able to raise. And so they've been saving their ad buys for now. But you're right, it does seem like everyone's been a bit slow on the draw here and still caught off guard. I mean, even Elections Ontario said that they had sort of been bracing for this possibility since last May, but even they have had to get some last minute things together. And so, yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like everyone is just having to put a campaign together while they're running it at the same time.
Uh, we're still very much early. Just for the record, folks, we're recording this on January 30th. So, by the time this airs, who knows? Everything could have changed. Who knows what's going to happen? But it seems to me that we're talking about politics and the issues, especially here in the 905, that are affecting people on the ground. Housing. We have the issues of homeless encampments here in the 905. Every city seems to have some kind of encampment. Housing prices are still running, soaring. We're not getting housing built according to the numbers. Yet I don't see anyone talking about that in this election. And I don't necessarily want to talk to you about strategy. I mean, it'll be unveiled, but it seems to me that the parties seem to not be talking about what people are concerned about on the ground: affordability, housing prices, rent, just the fact that so many homeless encampments are in our cities. Can you maybe just comment a bit about, like, are the parties kind of aware of what people are concerned about? I mean, it just seems like Ford's talking about Trump, Bonnie's talking about healthcare, and Marit Stiles recently was talking about buying back the 407, and not we're not gonna have to pay that, for billions of dollars, but not worry about paying it off. Nobody seems to be talking about what I'm hearing people talk about on their day-to-day issues. I'm just wondering, maybe we can talk about that, about in terms of party awareness of what's going on in Ontario.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like you and I live and breathe this stuff, but if I'm just like out and about, no one knows like there's an election on. They're like, what? And who are these
Yeah,
people?
exactly.
Didn't we just have an election? And people are asking me about Trudeau, and it's like, no, that's not that's not quite yet. But yeah, I think you're right, and I do think that we're going to start to see things shift as the campaign goes on. But it's interesting you're talking about issues because Leger actually had a poll out recently that ranked what was high on people's radar right now, especially as we go into an election, and Trump and the threat of tariffs, like U.S. relations, like was way down on the list. I think about 5% of people were saying that it was that important, or had ranked it at 5%. And then, top was cost of living, and then healthcare, and actually in particular access to a doctor, and housing was up there too. And it's interesting because when Ford launched in Windsor, it was all Trump, Trump, Trump. Nothing. He didn't mention housing. He didn't mention healthcare. And I do think that the onus is going to be on Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie if they really want to make a dent in Ford's support, to really hammer him on those points, because like you were talking about last minute announcements. It was just days before the campaign launched that the Conservatives announced 1.4 billion for primary care. They've got Dr. Jane Philpott reached across the aisle to get her to head up this primary care action team that's going to get everybody a family doctor in the next few years. And yet they're doing that sort of at the end of this whole thing, and when they've had 7 years. And so I think that's the line that we need to hear from the Liberals and the NDP. I think that they're probably going to start out just talking about how we don't need this election. But again, I don't know if that's really the best play here. I know you told me not to talk about strategy, but I think we'll have to see what actually is going to be the ballot box question. I feel like that's the big wild card here.
Well, on strategy, there's strategy, but there's also, like, how do you get your team organized and mobile? And I kind of want to focus a bit on the Liberals, because part of me, I maybe you can vouch for this. my take is this is a strategic call because right now the Liberals are very much divided. There's the federal leadership race happening. And I remember there was a memo, an infamous memo that went out from the Bonnie Crombie team to people saying, hey, if you're going to leave to go work on a leadership campaign, come talk to us because we need to figure this out. And I get the sense that the Liberals are worried that they might be losing some of their best on the ground organizers to go work for the on the federal leadership when the federal leadership candidates campaign. And is that a fact? Do you think this will be a factor of just like the Liberals just will not be grabbing the best of the best to lead this team, and that might be kind of fueling what Doug Ford wants to do here? So your opponents at their weakest. Now it's time to kind of stab the beast, so to speak.
Yeah, if I can toot my own horn, that memo was scooped in my newsletter,
I,
QPObserver.
I'm aware I read it, so
But yeah, you're right. I mean, that did kind of raise some eyebrows. You're right. And it is because, Bonnie Crombie has been losing some organizers, Tom Allison in particular, a veteran
hmm
war room
hmm
liberal guy, and he's now working on Chrystia Freeland's campaign. Something else that obviously was not lost on the conservatives. And it's not just organizers too, right? Like the party, like now with the federal liberal leadership race on there, this is a chance for that party to raise money. And, everyone's feeling the pinch right now. Our donors want to donate to provincially and federally. So there's a lot that they have to contend with. But pretty soon all parties would have had to contend with that. Like if there is a federal election coming this spring, then the NDP would have to be sharing resources, and same with the conservatives too. And so while the liberals might be feeling that a little bit more now, it could have been happening for the other provincial parties too. So you're right, that's obviously a factor here. But I'm also hearing from people close to Bonnie Crombie that the opposite is happening too. I just heard that just the other day they had a bus or like 3 vans of people from Ottawa come down and say we want to help because we're sick of what's happening with the federal party. And so I do think that there is some, they're having their own growing pains too. I think just like the other parties that are like, obviously there's no love lost between Pierre Poilievre and Doug Ford's people, and it's not like they're sharing resources either. So yeah, I think especially challenging for the Liberals, and that's working in the NDP and PC's favor.
I do find you mentioned the kind of animosity between the Pierre Poilievre federal conservatives and the Doug Ford provincial progressive conservatives, and it made me think that this might be the one provincial. Usually in a provincial election, the federal cousins of a party kind of come and help out the provincial, and then vice versa. It's kind of this, we all help each other out. And I'm thinking maybe this is the one election where ultimately it's just like no, each level is kind of on their own, uh, so to speak. And that I wonder just how that's going to impact the dynamic of this campaign
Yeah,
going forward.
I think you might be onto something because in last year with the by-elections, the conservatives actually, and like in Milton and Bay of Quinte, like they ended up actually hiring like door knockers and canvassers, like those
Right.
companies. And that's not unusual. It's not unheard of for parties to do that. But the reasoning behind it, I had heard from some organizers was that Pierre Poilievre is very popular and it's tricky to find volunteers to go door knocking. And so, obviously they wanted to hold on to those seats. And like I said, the conservatives have money to blow. They've been making it rain. And so that they went with that. But you're right. I think that that's also like part of the concern too.
Shifting gears a bit, we had touched upon this before we hit record. I'm wondering about just the coverage of this campaign, if that's going to be a factor. And by that, I mean, there's a lot of stories happening right now in the news. We have obviously Trump south of the border threatening tariffs, and we're watching that with bated breath to see will he, won't he, kind of mentality. The federal uh, liberal leadership race has thrown that into like there's essentially that national campaign going on right now, and those polls, people jockeying for headline space, and now we have the provincial Ontario election. As a journalist who covers this full time, like I know you have your Substack, but like how does this how do you cover this so that you give people the attention of the Ontario provincial election so that people are informed and able to make an educated decision. At the same time, you're competing for stories about the national federal liberal leadership, which I think again people should be aware of and know what's going on there. And what's Donald Trump going to do, tomorrow that's going to impact jobs and business? I'm not saying solve it, but I'm trying to say like give us an insight into like what goes on in your mind as this is going to unfold in the next few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it is like just a crazy time right now, and yeah, it is. I mean, it's a lot, right? Like for anyone. I mean, for my newsletter, I think that and for my readership, it's not so much about like going to follow the leaders, and actually find I mean, I know that is important, like for the bigger outlets or like the TV journalists, and to tell people here's what the leaders are saying and here's what they're pitching to you and helping to cut through that. I mean, I guess what I find is going to the following the leaders around as they tour is becomes very like talking points, and they're around there kissing babies and glad handing and having their rubber chicken dinners, and it is an opportunity I think to like press them on some of these policies, but there's not a lot of meat behind there. Like you mentioned, Marit Stiles and the NDP's proposal about scrapping tolls on the 407. I mean, I think there was some strategy there because it's a bold move, of course. There's not any costing behind it whatsoever, but we were all talking about it that day, on radio, on TV, print, social
Hmm.
media, and that's what the NDP wants to do. Like the polls say that people that don't know Marit Stiles, or people don't really know Marit Stiles, but those who do know her like her. And so it's up to the NDP to really raise her profile. A bold promise like that, or even tunneling under the 401, like Doug Ford has proposed, those grab headlines. And I don't know if they'll move votes, but it gets people talking and paying attention to what you're saying. And so yeah, I think that the challenge becomes cutting through that and explaining to people, what it is actually on offer here.
Hmm.
And I think that that is sort of better done, not necessarily for me anyway, being in front of Ford and trying to pin him down on, what is the stimulus package you're talking about? Because he's not really giving that away. It's just talking points. And so, yeah, I think it's on reporters, but it's also like on just citizens too, to kind of, look up actually and like do a bit of fact checking
Hmm.
of what these guys are talking about. I will just add quickly that the chief electoral officer, Greg Asenza, had just put out a report, just months ago, saying that this election is at risk of disinformation and because of the evolving AI. I had already even seen like a post on social media, people claiming that they had already voted when that wasn't the case. And so, yeah, it's really a lot to cut through.
I, I especially we kind of know like what the party tactics are. Doug Ford has come out and said like he will not be releasing a platform or costed platform. He's going to run on his record, which yeah, I'm not sure I want to do that, Dougie, but that's your strategy. But I mean, like something like that is that's alarming to me that a politician says, I want to run the province, but I'm not going to put a costed plan for the next 4 years of what I want to do. And I'm wondering, I know a lot of people listen and they're going to ask like, what do you do with that? Like, do you just say, well, he's not going to put a costed platform, so that's that. Um, like, how do you hold him to account for something that he's never promised?
Yeah, I mean it's very tricky, but you're right, and I will say though he gave a like a wishy-washy answer on that. First it said it wasn't going to be costed, and then it sort of sounded like it was. It. I guess just my sense of it is that it might be like a light version of the budget,
Hmm.
something similar that we've seen from them like in 2022. But don't forget, in 2018 they ran on an uncosted platform, and then they tabled that first budget and there was all this backlash, and then they made all these changes. So Ontario has voted for an uncosted platform before and then weren't happy when Doug Ford tabled a budget based on that uncosted platform. And then he backtracked on it. So I don't think it's necessarily like a deal breaker for Doug Ford not to have a fully costed platform, which is like not something I would have thought I would have ever said, but it's happened in the past, right? And I think that the vulnerability for Doug Ford becomes like you've had 7 years and like even just now with liberalizing alcohol sales, something that he promised back in 2018 is happening now, and it's going to cost us a lot more than we thought it would.
Hmm.
If we have Bonnie Crombie and Marit Stiles standing in Walkerton along with people waiting in line for a doctor and say this is like Doug Ford's Ontario, I think that's what we need to see from his rivals in order to like put a dent in his polling numbers right now. I will just add, like, in you brought up 1990, and part of Peterson's demise and Bob Ray's win was Mike Harris and the Conservatives just landing blow after blow with the Liberals. And obviously, Ontarians liked the way Bob Ray looked compared to Harris, but the Conservatives were doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it came to like criticizing Peterson, who was very popular before he pulled the trigger on the election. And so we haven't really seen that yet from the NDP or the Liberals. I think we'll start to see that as we ramp up into the campaign, as we go into the debate. We heard it might be around Family Day. Nothing is really set in stone yet, but campaigns matter, and I think a lot could change.
I'm also wondering, this is just me pontificating maybe, or just wondering, you know, right now those $200 checks that Doug Ford promised were going to be delivered to everybody, that's going to cost the Treasury however many hundreds of millions of dollars. They're landing, and we're getting reports now that some of them are bouncing. That some of those checks are not, they're coming back insufficient funds, which that's kind of alarming if you think about it. When the government check comes back as insufficient funds, I wondered about that. Like, how confident is this government on getting reelected when, again, I look at their track record and they do not have a lot of successes. Seven
Yeah, I
years,
mean,
and there's no legacy plan that they could like. This will stand the test of time, and this will be Doug Ford's legacy. Because I'm like, I don't know a single plan or project that I say, yeah, that's going to last for my kids till my kids are old people, or old men and old women. You know, like, just your thoughts on that as a record to stand on, I guess.
yeah, I mean, I was of the same mind that like where is the legacy projects from the Conservatives? Like they've had this whopping majority, and love or hate their politics, they have the power to like make some significant changes here. And I've heard from maybe small C conservatives or non Kool-Aid drinkers who say that they're really disappointed that there hasn't been legacy projects. And I do think that for Ford, those legacy projects are things like the Ontario line, or what's happening with Ontario Place, things that are going to take a long time to be realized and for people to actually like see the impact of that, right? But you mentioned the $200 checks and the hiccups that are going on there. Something that was framed as a pre-election ploy here, a bribe essentially from his rivals. But I think it speaks to like this larger theme of this government, that there's just been bad deal after bad deal. And that's something that I think is like fodder for Bonnie Crombie and Marit Stiles. And, they would do well to remind people about that. Like it's not just those, it's the liberalization of alcohol sales. And, don't even, we haven't even really talked about what happened with the green belt, right? And so I think that
Yes.
like there is vulnerabilities for Ford, but that's why he's not talking about housing and healthcare. He's talking about how, imagine if Marit or Bonnie were sitting across from Trump when Ford himself is not even sitting across from Trump.
I, I guess that's just what puzzles me about this election call when it comes down to it, is that you're right. I mean, no other province is calling an election because that said premier says I need a strong mandate to deal with Donald Trump. Ford himself is not going to meet with Trump. It'll be whomever is the prime minister who does that. Um, as well as the fact that like this government just honestly has a record of failure. I was thinking all the way back to the license plate fiasco, license plates, as you said, green belts, which was a costly endeavor, but ultimately was backtracking. Nothing happened there. Like every time that this government tries to do something, they're either caught. There's a controversy over who's getting paid what, or some special interest getting favors over another, and then it gets rolled back, or just blatant kind of incompetence that, again, $200 checks going out the door that aren't working, and yet they're still riding high. And I'm just wondering, like, is this the case of maybe Doug Ford did take for granted the goodwill of Ontarians, that they're like, the wheels haven't fallen off the truck yet, so just keep driving it. But it just, has he pushed his goodwill with Ontarians a bit too far with this one? Is my question.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that, like, even though the conservatives are still polling high, Doug Ford's own approval is not so hot right now. I mean,
Hmm.
he's like at the bottom of the line for, and Angus Reid when they rank all the premiers. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that it's not necessarily that he's so great, but that, or people love him, but that, the other parties have been having a really hard time getting traction and getting their message to stick. On campaign day, like, I was talking to my mom, who doesn't really follow politics closely, and she's like, who's Marit Stiles? I don't know anything about her. I don't know who Bonnie Crombie is. And like, yeah, I think that with this Snap campaign, it's the like Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie, it's the biggest struggle for them because they've had a really hard time getting their profile out there. I mean, Bonnie Crombie just became leader a few months ago. And so yeah, I think that, none of that is lost on Team Ford, and that it's the most advantageous for him. I mean, he was doing press conference after press conference as premier, like in the run up to this campaign. And so he was sucking up all the oxygen in the room. And I do think that, he's taking two trips to Washington during this campaign. Very unusual
Hmm.
dynamic.
Hmm.
To be campaigning and still doing premier like duties down there. Something that the Liberals have complained about in terms of like the caretaker convention. But I think that that's also hard to run against for Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie. If Doug Ford is in Washington, we don't really know what the situation is with the tariffs, but if he's down there going to bat for Canada, wearing this Captain Canada cape, it does become hard to run against that when he's down there advocating for Ontario. We did see like a positive response generally when he was doing all those media hits on Fox News and CNN,
Hmm.
when the feds were kind of being quiet on that front because of all the drama that was happening with Trudeau and his resignation. So I feel like it could go both ways. That's why I say, like, this election really feels like there's so many wild cards.
We're coming up on our time for the episode, and I kind of want to just, before we head out, uh, what are you looking for in this election? Whether that's a maybe a riding or two battle, but like, what would catch your eye, or perk your ears if you saw or heard something on this campaign trail that you say, this is a game changer, perhaps, that, I guess, put on your reporter hat and tell me, like, when's your sixth sense, your spidey sense, going to tingle a bit when you see something on the campaign trail?
Well, I think like the big thing is going to be the platforms, of course, and the debate. Like, if that's going to shift the needle, because yeah, I feel like it's still a big question of what the ballot box issue is. But what I'm looking for is, like, is this really going to be a cakewalk for Doug Ford? And will Bonnie Crombie and Marit Stiles be like, I guess, will they be running along the same lines? Or are they going to try and differentiate themselves? Because we know in this province, the progressive vote tends to split. That tends to favor conservatives. We even heard Marit Stiles at her campaign launch make an appeal specifically to liberal voters and paint Bonnie Crombie as Doug Ford light, and she said, Bonnie Crombie doesn't want to get rid of Doug Ford. She wants to be Doug Ford.
Hmm.
And so I think that that's really what I'll be looking for. You mentioned regions. There's a few I'm going to be paying close attention to. That's obviously the 905 vote rich area, can make or break you. Obviously, the conservatives picked up a lot of seats there. All of them essentially, even though they don't currently hold all of them. But they need to hang on to that area. The Liberals obviously want to pick up there. There's no love lost between folks in Brampton and Bonnie Crombie, but she's obviously going to try and make some inroads there, and especially in Mississauga. Meanwhile, the NDP lost seats in Mississauga and Brampton to the Conservatives, so they'll be pushing hard there. I'm also going to be paying attention to like the Windsor area, another like NDP conservative battle, Toronto, which is, Liberals versus NDP, and then the North, which is more like conservative versus NDP. So like those are sort of the shifts I'll be looking for that I
Mhm.
think will give us like a sign of, what the makeup of the legislature will be.
I definitely agree with you in the 905. I think for the first time it's going to be. I do think all three parties are poised to make some pickups in the region.
Yeah.
Very varied spots definitely throughout the region. Um, I am kind of looking forward to Hamilton Mountain. I just saw the two people that we had on the podcast before, Don Danko and Kojo Dampney, are running. Uh, Don Danko for the Liberals, Kojo for the NDP. I think that's going to be a interesting dynamic there. I am venturing outside the 905. I'm curious to know what Southwest Ontario is going to do, only because if you remember a few years ago, we had the big announcement from Ford and Trudeau about investments in battery plants, EV technology plants in the area. Billions of dollars in tax subsidies to encourage Volkswagen to set up a operation. And do you think that the Tories might have that region kind of locked down with that kind of investment into the territory?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and that would track. But I think that there's also this like, first of all, I will say there's like all this uncertainty of what's happening with Trump and the tariffs, right,
True.
and EVs and all of that. And actually, just now we got an announcement from Ford saying essentially just recommitting old dollars to like EVs and pushing the feds to shore up the sector. But you're right, but there is this interesting cross section of like Tory and NDP voters that tend to be in like the manufacturing type blue collar type like people, and so I think that would be interesting to see like how the NDP tries to make a play for it. But yeah, and at the same time, like the Liberals also need to make inroads in places there, in places like London, Barrie, if they really want to even get recognized party status, which is 12 seats. So yeah, I think that's also, I mean, I feel like that's also another region that we'll be keeping an eye on too.
I'm I think this might be one of the most consequential elections for a while that nobody's going to be paying attention to. And it's not because a lack of the hard work that you and your colleagues are doing. I just think there's calling an election now is just a whirlwind of priorities for Ontarians to just pull their attention in 20 different directions to now say, oh, now you've got to vote a new provincial government into power. It's quite the burden to put on the voter and the taxpayers' heads, in my opinion. It might be enough that people might just say, well, I got to ignore it because I have other things to worry about. Or is this going to be an opportunity for them to say, no, we're going to punish you for being this opportunistic? I agree. We'll wait and see how that works out.
Yeah, I mean, apathy is always the risk too, right? It's the middle of
Yep.
winter. Turnout could be low. People just, might sit this one out. But yeah, at the same time, I mean, that depresses me as someone who covers this stuff daily because it is important. And so, yeah, I do think you're right though. Like there could be some complacency out there. That's the risk. And especially if we're headed to the polls sooner than we think federally, there's the risk of voter fatigue and that, taking bringing down turnout. So I guess we just have to do our best to get people engaged and paying attention to this stuff.
I think no matter what, this early and this temperature that's outside, this is going to be the election that will determine if lawn signs are actually important to a campaign or not. Because we are going to see no lawn signs. That ground is rock solid frozen. You are not sticking anything in that ground. Uh, so maybe this will be the year that we find the election where we finally say, nope, lawn signs, stupid, waste of money, waste of plastic, no more. Save some landfill.
I
Maybe
mean, I actually did hear from a campaign manager who said it's really easy to just stick it in the snowbank. So there's
if there's
that.
enough snow, I have campaigned in this kind of weather, and it's like, yeah, if the snowbank's deep enough, sure, but you're not.
Depends
If
on
it
where you are.
depends where you are. Right now in the 905, we do not have 6 inches of snow that you can stick
Right.
a lawn sign in. It is that ground is frozen. You're gonna lean it up against like a fence or something. I don't know. Um, we'll wait and
People will
see.
have to get creative for sure.
Yeah, and I this might be it's those small things that I think have big impacts on getting that voter turnout, people aware that it's happening, you know?
Yeah, and even things like if you knock on someone's door, they're not going to be standing, forever with the door open, letting
Yes,
all the heat out, so you can give them your whole spiel about why you should vote for me, right? And so, I'd also heard concerns from wannabe MPP about, the snowbirds aren't here and they might
yep,
not vote, but I will say snowbirds can also vote by mail, so that's also
yes,
possible. But yeah, I mean, that might also just like put a hit if no if they're not going to vote by mail, and if you're not here they just might not bother. But yeah, I think turnout is something else to watch too, for sure.
I, I I'm also going to say, with technology being what it is, this might be the doorbell election where everybody goes to like the video doorbells, and those conversations just happen through the doorbell. Because how many people are going to say, "Yeah, I'm not staying with my door open in -10 weather, so you can sell me on your party's platform. You just tell me, and I'll sit on the couch. Thanks very much." Um, we'll see how that goes. Sabrina, thank you very much for your time. As always, love the work that you do and keeping us informed. Tell our listeners, where can they subscribe to your Substack,
So you just got to go to QPObserver.ca and everything's there.
and we'll have a link in our show notes for you folks. Thank you very much, Sabrina. All the best for the next few weeks. Stay on it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.